Hello, everyone. I'm Keith DeStone, and this is HeroesX Office Hours. Office Hours for version 13 of HeroesX. I'm here, as usual, with Greg and Sarah and Janet and Elen, and we are going to talk about the discussion questions for hours 7 and 8. The hour 7 question is, if no pictures had survived showing Achilles, would you think differently about this hero? Well, we see lots of pictures in hour 7. It's hard to imagine Achilles now without them, to be honest.
Yes.
But I'll try to project into this question. But what did folks have to say about this one?
Well, there's one comment or question about the chariot race. So the chariot races staged during festivals were ritual purification in later times. So about the blemish on his status as a legendary hero, does that blemish last it forever? Because it comes so often on the vase. So
Yeah, well, I think the blemish lasts forever, not only if we look at pictures of Achilles on the vase where he is committing an atrocity, but the blemish is there even in our Iliad as we have it. And yes, the blemish lasts forever. On the other hand, the attempt to purify the blemish also lasts forever. In other words, it's not so much a mark of shame. It's something that simply requires purification, and purification happens by way of performance within the ritual context of events like the Pan-Athenaic Festival in Athens in late August every 4 years. In other words, if you accept my argument that myth in the heroic age is full of acts that are polluted, yes, there are all sorts of amazing, larger-than-life accomplishments that are positive, but then there are also these larger-than-life defects, accomplishments that are morally questionable. And what are you going to do with that legacy from the heroic age? Well, in the so-called present, and then in the future, which is presumed to last forever, you make up for it year after year after year at the seasonally right time and right place, so that within the ritual framework of what myths tell us, we, by reenacting the myths, essentially purify the pollution forever. And I like to emphasize the positive side of that, which is that, yes, there are questionable things, morally questionable things that happen in the heroic age, but it all comes out in the wash, so to speak, if you look at it as an eternal recycling. I'm sorry I went on and on and on about that, but that was such a good question. I couldn't resist.
One of the participants said he or she already heard about stories, and there was a picture in his mind, and then seeing the vases just intensified. Now this audio conversation, continuous conversation, can we trace this conversation through literature and pottery in antiquity?
Well, we can trace it, but then we keep coming up against contradictions. One of the things that especially worries me is that Achilles can be represented as beardless with long hair, in which case he's very much like Apollo, or he can be bearded with relatively short hair. And how do you reconcile that? a related problem, sometimes Patroklos seems to be represented as older than Achilles, and sometimes you can't tell. When he's represented as older than Achilles, and that happens in some vase paintings, the tendency is, as far as I can see, that it's Patroklos who is bearded and Achilles is not bearded. But then in other situations, Achilles himself is bearded. We haven't yet talked about vase paintings that show Achilles and Penthesilea, the Amazon, in mortal combat with each other. And I'm so stuck with that image of a bearded, short-haired Achilles killing Penthesilea. There are versions like that. And so I can't really trace the Achilles figure in a neat linear way from earlier to later, because there seem to be so many variations in how you look at him, whether you look at him as an ephebic figure. By ephebic, I mean somebody who is either 16 to 18 or maybe 18 to 20. I'm using Athenian standards, in which case, well, he may or may not have a beard, or whether we think of him as an adult, as a potential husband of characters like Briseis, or even as we considered this situation the other day, Andromache. Well, of course, Achilles and Andromache are never a pair, but the son of Achilles and Andromache are a pair. They do become a pair. And what do you make of that? So it's messy, but I think the messiness still is more in our mind than in the mind of a song culture that is able to see Achilles at several different stages of his development toward adulthood. I don't dare say into adulthood.
There's sort of always that potential. And a number of the participants are saying, well, maybe it didn't change so much as deepen their understanding. And some people have been quite intrigued by the depiction of him as a chariot fighter or chariot rider, and they're also thinking about other visual arts like sort of fresco sculpture depictions as well. So is that another medium that again has that variation in how he's depicted, but also those ritualized events that we were talking about earlier?
Yes, yes. And one thing that astounds me is that in the Olympics, which is the athletic festival that we all focus on because it has such enormous prestige, even in comparison to the three other so-called crown games, I prefer to call them garland athletic events, and in comparison to the Athletic Festival of Athens, the great one, the Pan-Athenaea. At the Olympics, there is no apobatic chariot racing. And that really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? Because the paintings that I show in the collection that you see in Ancient Greek Hero in 24 Hours, those video examples, they all seem to be referencing the athletic festival at Athens, which is the Pan-Athenaea. But that's not only an athletic festival where you actually had apobatic chariot racing, it was also the festival where the Iliad and the Odyssey were performed. And then the question is, in the 6th century, was the ending of the Iliad identical to the ending that we know from the transmission that goes on into the 5th century? or is the 6th century ending different? Where maybe even the chariot race that we know from scroll 23 might be an apobatic chariot race rather than a non-apobatic chariot race, which is what we read, of course, in our version of the Iliad.
So all sorts of possibilities for these variants, and
Yes.
seeing the visual arts not as quote unquote an illustration of
Exactly.
any either our Iliad or any alternative earlier variant version, but they're all part of that same cultural expression.
Yes, yes, beautifully said. Yes, and so I have no regrets in asking a question that leads to maybe further questions. I have no regrets because I think we have succeeded if we find this kind of response that we're getting from our participants, which is that, my goodness, this picture is even more varied than I had thought. And I keep having that impression even after all these years. I just can't get over how much variation there is when I contemplate the Song of Achilles, if I can put it that way.
Well, speaking of other questions, further questions, we have another one on our plate for today. And that is, have the pictures showing Patroklos complicated, or have they simplified your understanding of this hero? How about that one? What are folks saying?
There are several questions, but one question is, do psūkhē of other heroes appear on Greek vases?
Yes, they do. I wouldn't dare to say who they are necessarily, but yes. Let me just leave it at that. There's no absence of making references to the psūkhē as the disembodied conveyor of identity after death in paintings. That's fine. Depending on what the era is, they may appear life-size, as Patroklos did in the Iliad, but as Patroklos does not in the paintings we see, where he is a miniature size replica of the life-size Patroklos. But I think, for example, of a vase where we see Odysseus conjuring the psūkhē of Elpenor, the unfortunate sailor who broke his neck and required a funeral during the journey back home of Odysseus and his comrades. And in the vase painting I have in mind, which is more classical era, Elpenor, or the psūkhē of Elpenor, is life-size. And he's emerging from a swamp. It's very ghostly.
And people are talking about how Achilles's and Patroklos's fates, maybe, let's put it, Kleos's, are intertwined. And we see Patroklos's psūkhē on a pottery. Is this psūkhē foiling Achilles' psūkhē? And do we have any pottery showing Achilles' psūkhē?
Well, in a way, the Münster Hydria, which simply labels the miniature hero who is hovering over the sema, which will be a sema that is shared by Patroklos and Achilles after Achilles also dies, that psūkhē could technically be the Psūkhē of Achilles and not Patroklos. So in my question, I was actually thinking primarily of the Münster Hydria, and how in that case, the miniature replica of what you see when you see the hero in real life, so to speak, that miniature replica is labeled Psūkhē. It doesn't say, the labeling doesn't say Psūkhē of Patroklos, it just says Psūkhē. Now, because then we look at other vase paintings like the Boston Hydria, where that same Psūkhē is labeled Patroklos, okay, then we say, well, that's the Psūkhē of Patroklos. But in a way, these paintings, at least in my mind, both simplify my understanding and complicate my understanding simultaneously of the Iliad as we have it, because the Iliad certainly, our Iliad certainly makes it clear that the Sema that will be the abode of Achilles when he dies is already the Sema of Patroklos, right? And what we see in the Iliad is then actually reenacted in Odyssey 24, where it is made explicit that Patroklos shares the tomb of Achilles with Achilles, that Patroklos is housed in that tomb first by himself, and then when Achilles dies, then he too is housed, and that's when the tumulus supposedly gets bigger and even more elaborate, because now it's housing, how shall I say it, two aspects of maybe one heroic image. Two aspects being Patroklos first and then Achilles second.
There's also been discussion rethinking the role as therapon, and then, as you were just saying, that the two of them are going to be together. So again, we get that kind of doubling up and substitution or interchangeability almost.
Yes, yes.
And then also thinking about, well, has this concept of the Psūkhē in some way, is that something that appears within other cultures, not just in ancient Greek culture or related culture, as we've seen that the concept of the therapon has come in from other cultures?
A very good example is the case of Savitri in the Indic epic tradition, where you have a very clear description of her husband as a miniature-sized replica of his former self once he is dead, and how the god of the dead comes with a noose and then just takes the miniature replica of the living hero and takes him all bound into the realm of the dead. And so there too we see the idea that somehow the disembodied conveyor of identity after death is miniaturized. It's the Tom Thumb sized version of the real self. And are you proud of me that all this time I have not used the popular culture term mini-me? But I've just done it. I feel so guilty.
Well, you're showing us all sorts of connections, Greg, as usual. As usual.
Yes.
That's about our time for today. So I'll just thank you all for joining us again.
Thank you.
Till next time.
And thank you all.